Samadhipada, Section 1, Yoga Sutras, Sutra 46. Ta eva sabija samadhi. Those only with seed having an objective samadhi. They, stages corresponding to subtle objects, constitute only samadhi with seed. All objects within the realm of Prakriti upon which samyama may be performed to discover their relative reality have been summed up in Sutra 45. Samadhi, which deals with any of these objects, is called Savija Samadhi for reasons explained in connection with Sutra 42. Now, Sutra 42, if you remember, is Savitarka Samadhi is that in which knowledge based only on words, real knowledge, and ordinary knowledge based on sense perception or reasoning are present in a mixed state, and the mind alternates between them. Samadhi which deals with any of these objects is called Savija Samadhi for reasons explained in connection with Sutra 42. An object on which samyama is performed is technically called a seed, whether it is gross or subtle. So, Savija Samadhi may also be called objective Samadhi as opposed to nirbīja Samadhi or subjective Samadhi, in which there is no object or seed of meditation. The seeker himself is the object of his search. I'm sure you've heard that said a lot. I'm going to say it again. The seeker himself is the object of his search. The seer, who has gained the capacity to see truly all objects within the realm of Prakriti, now wants to see himself as he really is. What distinguishes Savija Samadhi from Nirbīja Samadhi is therefore the presence of an object associated with Prakriti whose relative reality has to be realized. In Nirbīja Samadhi, Purusha, who is beyond the realm of Prakriti, is the objectless objective. He is the seeker as well as the object of the search. In Savija Samadhi, also, he is really seeking himself, but a veil, however so thin, still obscures his vision. In Nirbīja Samadhi, he attempts to tear off the last veil in order to obtain a completely unobstructed vision of himself. This is what is meant by self-realization. Sutra 47. Nirvichara Vaisharadya Dhyatma Prasada. Nirvichara Vaisharadya Dhyatma Prasada. Samadhi of the Nirvichara stage on the refinement, on attaining the utmost purity, spiritual lucidity, clarity. On attaining the utmost purity of the Nirvichara stage of Samadhi, there is the dawning of the spiritual light. Sutra 47 is meant to draw a distinction between the lower and higher stages of Samadhi, and to emphasize that spirituality is not necessarily associated with all the stages. We have seen already that Savija Samadhi begins on the plane of the lower mind, and its province extends up to the Atmic plane, at which point in these successive stages of Samadhi does the light of spirituality begin to dawn in consciousness. To be able to answer this question, we should recall that the intellect is the separative and constrictive principle in man, which distorts his vision and is responsible for the common illusions of the lower life. As long as consciousness is functioning within the realms of the intellect alone, it must remain bound by those illusions. Samadhi in the realm of the intellect, while it reveals the lower aspect of the reality which is hidden behind the objects on which samyama is performed, does not necessarily bring with it perception of the higher truths of a spiritual nature. Does not, for instance, give a vision of the fundamental unity of life. It is conceivable, for example, that a scientist may discover many of the truths underlying the physical world by means of samadhi, and yet remain absolutely unaware of the deeper spiritual truths which are associated with spirituality. Some of the lower cities, such as those dealt with in section 328 through 32, can be obtained in this manner. In fact, the black magicians, who are called brothers of the shadow, are all yogis who are proficient in the technique of lower yoga and undoubtedly possess many of the lower cities. But their work is confined within the realm of the intellect, and they remain ignorant of the higher truths of existence. Their selfish outlook and evil ways debar them from entering into the deeper and spiritual realms of consciousness, and thus acquiring true wisdom and spiritual illumination. This sutra points out that spiritual illumination begins to flood the mind when the yogi has reached the last stage of nirvichara samadhi. Nirvikara. Nirvikara or nirvichara samadhi. This sutra points out that spiritual illumination begins to flood the mind when the yogi has reached the last stage of nirvichara samadhi and is in the borderland which separates the intellect from the next higher spiritual principle, buddhi or intuition. In this stage, the light of buddhi, which is the source of wisdom and spirituality, begins to shed its radiance on the intellect. Illuminated in this manner, the intellect ceases to be a slave of the lower self and becomes a willing instrument of the higher self, working through Atma, Buddhi, Manas. For the distortions and illusions associated with the intellect are not really inherent in this principle. They are due to the absence of spiritual illumination. An intellect illuminated by the light of Buddhi and under the control of the Atma is a magnificent and powerful instrument, which even the adepts use constantly in their work. Let me read that again, because what a beautiful statement that is. An intellect illuminated by the light of Buddhi and under the control of the Atma is a magnificent and powerful instrument, which even the adepts use constantly in their work. So the mind is very powerful, right? The intellect, illuminated by the light of Buddhi and under the control of the Atma, is a magnificent and powerful instrument which even the adepts use constantly in their work. Okay. Sutra 48. Ritambara Tatra Prajna. Truth-bearing, right-bearing, their higher state of consciousness experienced in Samadhi. There the consciousness is truth and right-bearing. In the previous sutra, the stage at which the purely intellectual consciousness is converted into spiritual consciousness in Samadhi was pointed out. The present sutra gives an important attribute of the new type of consciousness which emerges as a result of this change. This is called Ritambhara. This word is derived from two Sanskrit roots, Ritam, R-T-A-M, which means the right, and Bahara, which means right bearing. Ritam and Satyam, the true, are two words of very profound significance in the scripture of the Hindus, and being correlatives are generally used together. Although they are sometimes used synonymously, there is a subtle distinction in their meaning, which many people find it difficult to grasp. To understand this, we should recall the well-known doctrine of Eastern philosophy, according to which the universe, both seen and unseen, is a manifestation of a divine reality or spirit which abides within it and is the ultimate cause and source of all that takes place in it in terms of time and space. That reality is referred to as Sat, S-A-T, and its existence in the universe manifests in two fundamental ways. In the first place, it constitutes the truth or the very essence of all things. This is called Satyam. In the second place, it determines the ordered course of things both in their material and moral aspect. This is called Ritam. Satyam is thus the relative truth underlying manifestation constituting the realities of all things. Ritam is the cosmic order, including all laws, natural, moral, or spiritual, in their totality, which are eternal and inviolable in their nature. Satyam and Ritam will therefore be seen to be two aspects of Sat in manifestation, one static and the other dynamic. They are inseparable and together constitute the very foundation of the manifested universe. Ritambara Prajna is thus that kind of consciousness which gives an unerring perception of the right and the true underlying manifestation. Whatever is perceived in the light of this prajna must be right and true. In dealing with the previous sutra, the distorting influence of the intellect was referred to, and we saw how the intellect, without the illumination of buddhi, is incapable of perceiving the deeper truths of life. Let us consider briefly how this obscuration which is brought about by the intellect works. In our search for knowledge, we want the truth as a whole, but the intellect allows us to see only a part of the truth at a time. So the knowledge derived through the intellect is never perfect, can, by its very nature, be never perfect. The manner in which our intellect brings about this fragmentation of truth and prevents us from seeing things as they are is realized only when we transcend the intellect in Samadhi and penetrate into the deeper realms of consciousness lying beyond the intellect. Not only is nothing seen as a whole by the intellect, but nothing is seen in its correct perspective in its relation to other things and other truths which exist at the same time. This results in exaggerating the importance of partial truths, misusing knowledge concerning natural forces, adopting wrong means to gain right ends, and so many other evils of which the modern civilization based on intellect provides so many and such glaring instances. This lack of wholeness and lack of perspective must characterize all knowledge and action based on intellect, divorced from wisdom. The knowledge obtained in Samadhi when the light of buddhi illuminates the mind is not only free from error and doubt, but also related to the underlying cosmic law which governs manifestation. Now, this is interesting. So this reminds me, it's so interesting. So doubt has always been a really significant presence in my mind, in my life. And it was instilled in me at a young age from my parents and I guess teachers and stuff like that. But I became so clear when I was living at the ashram, and after I moved out of the ashram, I lived with my parents for about 6 months before I moved back out on my own. And it was interesting to see how engaging with my parents and their predominant perspectives and their doubts, right, started to kind of infiltrate and muddy the clarity that I had obtained and attained when I was in that very pure environment. It's really interesting to see, to watch how that was happening and to witness that and being like, how do I prevent this from happening? Like it's almost unavoidable. Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, not only is nothing seen as a whole by the intellect, but nothing is seen in its correct perspective in its relation to other things and other truths which exist at the same time. This results in exaggerating the importance of partial truths, misunderstanding knowledge concerning natural forces, adopting wrong means to gain right ends, and so many other evils of which the modern civilization based on intellect provides so many and such glaring instances. This lack of wholeness and lack of perspective must characterize all knowledge and action based on intellect, divorced from wisdom. And we also have distorted perceptions of what constitutes wisdom, right? Sometimes we think people are wise and they're actually very distorted in their thinking. The knowledge obtained in Samadhi when the light of buddhi illuminates the mind is not only free from error and doubt, but also related to the underlying cosmic law which governs manifestation. It is based not only on truth, but also on right, ritambara, right, truth-bearing, right? That is why the prajna or consciousness functioning in these higher stages of Samadhi is called ritambara. The knowledge which the yogi gets is not only perfectly true, but he is incapable of misusing that knowledge. as knowledge obtained through the intellect alone can be misused. Life and action based on such knowledge must be righteous and in accordance with the great law which governs the whole universe. Okay, so I'm going to read one more and then we'll stop for today. Sutra 49. Shrutanumana prajnabhyam anya vishaya vishesartatvat. Shrutanumana prajnabhyam anya vishaya vishesartatvat. Heard based on revelation or testimony, based on inference, from these two levels of higher consciousness, having another object or content because of having a particular object. The knowledge based on inference or testimony is different from direct knowledge obtained in the higher states of consciousness because it is confined to a particular object or aspect. In the previous sutra, one prominent characteristic of the new consciousness which dawns on the refinement of Nirbīja Samadhi was pointed out. This sutra clarifies still further the distinction between intellectual and intuitive knowledge. As was pointed out in section 1, Sutra 7, there are three sources of right knowledge: direct cognition, inference, and testimony. All these three are available in the realm of the intellect. Direct cognition, however, plays a very limited part in this realm because it is confined to the unreliable reports received through the sense organs. These unreliable reports received through the sense, these reports by themselves do not give us right knowledge and have to be constantly checked and corrected by the other two methods mentioned above. We see the sun rising in the east every morning, moving across the sky and sinking in the west. But by inference, we know that this is mere illusion and the sun appears to move on account of the rotation of the earth on its axis. In the same way, the familiar world of forms, colors, etc., which we cognize with our sense organs, has no real existence. It is all a play of electrons, atoms, molecules, and various kinds of energies, which science has discovered. We hardly realize what an important part inference and testimony plays in our life until we try to analyze our ordinary knowledge and the means of obtaining it. These two instruments of obtaining and correcting knowledge are peculiarly intellectual and are not necessary in the higher realms of mind, which transcend the intellect. A person who is obliged to discover objects in a room which is utterly dark is obliged to feel them carefully, but does not need to adopt this crude method of discovery and investigation if he's able to get a light. He can see them directly. Knowledge on the spiritual planes beyond the intellect is based neither on inference nor on testimony, but only on direct cognition. But this direct cognition, unlike the direct cognition through the sense organs, is not subject to error and does not require correction by means of inference and testimony. What does the phrase vishesartatvat mean? Literally, it means because of having a particular object. It has been pointed out already that the intellect is capable of grasping only one thing at a time, either one object or one aspect of an object. It is this fragmentation of knowledge, this inability to see things in the background of the whole, which is the greatest limitation of intellectual perception, and intuitive perception is free from this limitation. In the higher realms of consciousness, each object is not seen in isolation, but as part of a whole in which all truths, laws, and principles have their due place. The intellect is like a telescope which can be directed only on a particular star, and can see it in isolation from other stars. Intuitive consciousness is like the eye which can see the whole heavens simultaneously and in true perspective. The analogy is no doubt crude, but it may help the student to grasp the difference between the two types of consciousness. The need for taking the help of inference and testimony arises because of the insufficiency of knowledge, and this insufficiency is due to the absence of the whole in the background. It is true that intuitive knowledge may not be perfect and may lack the precision and detail of intellectual knowledge, but as far as it goes, it is free from the possibility of error and distortion. A dim light in a big room may not give a clear picture of its contents, but it enables things to be seen in their proper proportion and perspective. As the light becomes stronger, all things are seen more clearly, but in the same proportion and perspective. On the other hand, a man who is groping in the dark, feeling one object after another, may get an entirely wrong idea with regard to any object, and will have to revise his uncertain conclusions constantly, and sometimes drastically. Okay, so that was the end of 49. 50 is the impression produced by it, Sabbija Samadhi, stands in the way of other impressions. What does that mean? We'll read that next time. Thank you for joining me today.